Hello and welcome to another episode of Speed Bumps. I'm your host, Charlie Kimball. Now, today's guest is an Ironman. Yes, I say that correctly, an Ironman who's overcome many speed bumps in his successful sporting and working life. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes while in law school, and he decided to live out his philosophy of hard work and determination. He began competing in Ironman triathlons, eventually qualifying for the U.S. national triathlon team. He's completed 14 Ironman triathlons, 20 half Ironman triathlons, and 8 marathons, including 3 Boston marathons. In 2006, he and his teammates won the 3,000-mile race across America, cycling nonstop, not in stages, but through the night, nonstop, from San Diego to Atlantic City in 5 days and 16 hours. We're going to definitely talk about that. As well as these incredible physical tests, he's built a successful legal career. He's become a motivational speaker, particularly focusing on overcoming obstacles related to type 1 diabetes. He, like me, has partnered with Novo Nordisk in the past to raise awareness about proper diabetes management. He's also the author of Finish Line Vision: Find Your Passion, Overcome Your Obstacles, Fuel Your Life. He's still a practicing lawyer, and beyond his professional and athletic achievements, he's a dedicated husband and father of 3 who enjoys living life in the Carolinas. Please help me welcome the Ironman, Jay Hewitt. Jay, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Charlie. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's great to catch up. Jay and I worked together a lot over the years, different ambassador work with Novo Nordisk, and we'd see each other at different trainings and events, and came to a few races and things like that. And I want to start with your diagnosis story, right? The first speed bump, at least that I'm aware of in your life. You know, you're in law school and you get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. What did that look like?
Yeah, it was, most people don't expect it. Maybe some do if they feel if there's, another family member in their life that has diabetes, they're used to it. But for me, it hit me completely out of the blue. I was a little old for diagnosis at the time. I was 24 when I was diagnosed. It was 1991. It was actually back when they used to call type 1 diabetes juvenile diabetes. That's why you have the JDRF, Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, but they've since stopped using that term because historically it was always a juvenile. It was someone who was a, adolescent, maybe a young teen. And I was in law school and living life, just normally as a first-year law student, and started just feeling sick in the kind of cold, gloomy months of February and January and leading into February. And I thought I had the flu. And so I just medicated it with, typical 24-year-old, idiot. I just drank orange juice and said, I'll keep going. And of course, knowing now, you got type 1 diabetes and your blood sugar is elevated and you keep pouring orange juice down your throat. And I was eating ice cream because my throat was hurting so much. And I'm just pouring sugar and glucose into my system. And after several days, I was going downhill fast, and no one was watching over me because I was living with my brother, who was really kind of doing his own thing in graduate school and didn't have parents around. I'm 24, trying to go to class, and I finally ended up essentially going almost unconscious. I was in DKA, and
Oh, wow.
and my brother helped me.
I'll pause you there, Jay. DKA, for those of our listeners that aren't as familiar with some of the diabetes terms, is diabetes ketoacidosis. So basically, when your blood sugar is elevated and super high for an extended period of time, your body starts to burn muscles and fat stores. And the side effect of that is an acid that builds up in your blood. If it builds up too much, you end up in DKA, and it can lead to some really nasty things, coma, death, things like that. So really bad situations. So you're essentially bordering on the edge of DKA. And you said your brother. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, he found me. I was in my room in our apartment, and he helped me to the infirmary of the law school of the we were at the University of South Carolina, and I don't remember it. I was unconscious at that point, and I woke up in the emergency room. They transferred me to the emergency room, and this is the part I do remember, because I don't know how long I'd have been in the emergency room, but they had hooked me up to a lot of fluids, and I'd been in there, no doubt, for a while. And I remember a doctor coming in and speaking to me, and I remember her, when I woke up, she told me her name, and she said, "Yeah, I'm Dr. McFarland. Your blood sugar is dangerously high." And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what blood sugar. I didn't really ever think about blood sugar, so I just kind of looked at her, and she said, "You have diabetes." And I sat there and I just kind of let these thoughts go through my head, and I looked up and said, "What's diabetes?" Because I didn't know. I mean, no one in my family has diabetes. I mean, I'd heard of it, but it was just a term. And she told me, and I said, and I felt like I was dying. I mean, I was lying in there. I was hooked up to tubes, and I had oxygen, and I was being monitored, and I said, "Am I going to die?" And she said, "No." She said, "You're going to be okay, but it's going to be a long road." And I said, "Is there a cure?" And that's kind of typical of me. I'm always looking for, like, what's the solution?
Right.
How do we fix this? And she kind of sighed. This is 1991. And ironically, if you had asked me, in the years and months after that, would I still be thinking the answer would be the same in 2024? But she said, "No, there's no cure, not today." And I just kind of rolled over, and tears, just kind of came to my eyes, and I thought, okay, my life's going to be different. And it was from that point that I had to adjust to it, and what it was going to mean for me. So
That's amazing, Jay, because that diagnosis story is eerily similar and very familiar to mine. I didn't end up unconscious or in the emergency room, but it made me really emotional because it took me right back to that moment when the nurse looked at me and said, "I think you have diabetes." And I went, "What's that? Like, what does that mean? And is there a cure? Can I just take a prescription and I'll be over this like the flu, right? Like you originally thought you had the flu." And that really took me back. Okay, so you're in the hospital, you have diabetes, there's no cure. How do you go and what takes you from a new member of this club that has diabetes and go to becoming an athlete and an Ironman and still in law school and getting your law degree and becoming a lawyer? What does the short term after diagnosis look like? And then where do you go from there?
it took me several years to really accept diabetes. I wasn't denying that I had it. This is 1991, so we were still dealing with the tail end of pork insulin. We didn't have synthetic insulin really that much in the late 90s or early 90s. It was starting to, we certainly didn't have the technology that we have today, continuous glucose monitors, insulin pumps. And so I was walking around with syringes and vials of insulin. Didn't even really have pens, the insulin pens that we have now. So I kept it really quiet. I was ashamed of it. I was nervous that people were going to look at me as sick. I was a young guy, like, what girl's ever going to want to date me, marry me? Is this going to mean I'm going to have a limb amputated? Am I going to go blind? And so I really hid it. But I certainly was monitoring it as best I could. And it wasn't until 1999, so I guess about 8 years later, I'd graduated from law school, have been practicing law a few years, and was just kind of struggling as best you can to deal with it, but was handling it. And well, actually, I remember the first thing I did, I had this just sort of angry determination about diabetes, and I wanted just to prove, that it was messing with the wrong guy. And one of the first things, I got inspired to try to do something, and I came out, near you, to California, and had a friend who was a lawyer in California, and he was a climber, and he was going to climb Mount Whitney, and it's the highest mountain in the lower 48, and so he invited me to come with him, and I came out there and I climbed Mount Whitney with him, which is no great feat, but it was something for me, having not ever done something like that. And then, I thought, I got this flyer in the mail one day about running a marathon, and I thought, marathon. I mean, who runs marathons? Those are for those, like, fit, endurance athletes. I'd never run, bike, swam. And so, but I thought, this is for the American Diabetes Association. I'll do it. It's kind of my coming out of the closet, about diabetes. I had to now disclose to everybody that I had diabetes, and will you contribute to my campaign? But I thought, I'm not going to ask you just to contribute. I'm going to run the marathon myself. And so I did that in Hawaii, and that's really right there what happened. It was the Kona Marathon in Kona, Hawaii. I knew nothing about where that would lead me, but I did it as a fundraiser, and I was so proud of myself for having run a marathon. And I didn't run cross country. I think I'd run a 10K before in my life, but and it was at the conclusion of that marathon where something happened that started me on the path to racing Ironmans. And it was a conversation that I had there. I've told this story a few times, but, the Kona Marathon is, it's hot. It's in June, of all godforsaken times to run a marathon in Hawaii. They start at 5 a.m. because it's so hot. And so I'm sitting there at the finish of it, and I am absolutely exhausted and ecstatic, because I've just run a marathon with type 1 diabetes, and there's this guy sitting next to me, and I'm just kind of laying there. And he leans over to me and he says, this is where they run the Ironman triathlon. And those guys will swim 2.5 miles out there in the Pacific Ocean. Then they'll bike 112 miles up to Hawaii and back. And then they'll run this marathon. And all I had done was just run the marathon, different time of year. And I was so exhausted. I was so nauseous. I just leaned over to that guy and I threw up on him. Because I thought, what kind of freak of fitness can do that? I mean, I just ran a marathon. I mean, wasn't that good enough for you? Those guys swim 2.5 miles, bike 112, and then they run this marathon. And, you'll understand this. It's those things like that where you do something and then someone says, there's actually something else that you could maybe do. And he challenged me, not intentionally, but it did. I said, as I'm flying back over the Pacific, if I can run a marathon, maybe I can do the Ironman. And so it started me on the path of then the goals of trying to race at least one,
Right.
one Ironman.
Well, so I think that's incredible. And you sort of glossed over the fact that you climbed Mount Whitney with no experience, with type 1 diabetes, just kind of cold. Like, your buddy called you and was like, "Hey, I'm going to do this." And you're like, "Yeah, why not? I'll figure it out. Let's go." And then you get a flyer in the mail that says, "Hey, go run a marathon." And you're like, "Yeah, I'll figure that out. Sure." Like, were you training for that at that moment? Like, when you got the flyer, did you do much training to prepare for that marathon?
Yeah, most charities, whether it's, diabetes, leukemia, Team in Training, a lot of these organizations, they have training programs. And so, yeah, I signed up for their training program. Didn't really have, running shoes and stuff like that. I mean, I was fit, but I was by no means a running fit. And so I did the running, preparation that they offered for me for, a few months, several months. And a lot of it is also not so much training your body, but when you got type 1 diabetes, you've got to train the physiology, the nutrition, everything to figure out, what do I need to eat before, during, and after. Not so much in a marathon. You don't eat so much in a marathon, but just trying to figure out the blood sugar. And, this is 1999. Again, no continuous glucose monitor. And didn't really, even the blood sugar meters were were still kind of old and took a long time, and the insulins were not real stable and steady. The basal insulins were, I was still using what's called NPH, which is just a very unpredictable basal insulin, and your blood sugar can just plummet, kind of unsuspectingly. And so I was just trying to just stumble through that, not blindly, but just really paying attention every day. And so it was comforting to me that I was running it with a diabetes charity. Um, but I was the only guy that had diabetes. Most people were running it for a family member
Right.
who had diabetes. So in a way, it wasn't like I had a whole healthcare team there at my feet and following me, but that made it also me feel like I'm contributing and I'm not accepting. And that's the way I've always looked at diabetes is I respect my diabetes, but I'm not going to surrender to it. And that's why I wanted to do that.
I love that phraseology, Jay. I think it resonates really with me as well, right? I respect it. It's there. I almost talk about it like it's a third person, right? It's this extra being here that's with me all the time, and respecting it, but never surrendering to it is really powerful. Now, how did you go from throwing up on the guy who told you about my Ironmans to then competing in them and cycling with some incredible cyclists and then winning a race across the country with teammates?
Well, it was a long process there because, when I finished that marathon in 2000, I had to start figuring out, okay, what is this Ironman thing and where are they? And, the internet was still kind of clunking along in 2000. And, but, we had about 4 maybe Ironmans in the US at that point. And I thought, well, maybe I'm going to need a few years to work up to this. So I signed up for I actually did another marathon for the American Diabetes Association. I thought, well, what better to do than just to keep training? It was in Rome, Italy, so a nice place to be. So I kept raising money. And that's, I always encourage people, if you have a goal, maybe do something to help others while you're pursuing your goal. And so that I enjoyed that. And so I raced a few shorter triathlons, had my eye on Ironman in November of 2002 in Panama City Beach, Florida, the Ironman Florida. And so I worked up to that, did a lot of about 4 half Ironman triathlons, several Olympic triathlons, distance triathlons, shorter distances. Then I also, I hired a coach, which, I talk about this in my book and you'll understand that, you, as much as an individual and determined person as I am, you need a mentor, you need a coach, when you're trying to do something that's beyond your grasp. And so there was a coach. I saw a guy when I was doing a short distance triathlon, and it was one of my first Olympic distance races. And this guy crossed the finish line. He was finishing about the time I was starting the bike, and I found him after the race and I approached him, and it was in South Carolina, and I came up to him, and I remember he sort of looked at me as if, are you serious about doing this? And I said, yes. And it turned out his name is Peter Kotland. He was from the Czech Republic. And he and I became really good friends after that. He started coaching me. He has an incredible story about overcoming obstacles growing up in Eastern Europe in the 70s and 80s, and then trying to get out when the wall came down. And so he was a professional triathlete. And so that's one thing I always tell people is find a mentor, find a coach, find someone who's better than you to show you what to do, and don't let your pride get in the way. And so he helped me a lot to get ready for that first one. And, I finished the first one in a little under 12 hours. They'll let you stay out there for 16. So I was pretty happy. I was kind of in the middle of the pack for my first one, but for me, that was, I thought I had, done the greatest accomplishment. I look back at myself, that kid, or the guy 2 years earlier at the Kona Marathon, and I wanted to say, how do you like me now? So, but then, I thought, gosh, if I can do one, maybe I can do another. And so it just became then a passion and a goal to just keep racing. And I got better and better. So, and surrounded myself with better athletes who specialized. And you mentioned, um, you mentioned cyclists. Yeah, I live in Greenville, South Carolina. A good friend of mine is George Hincapie, who at that time was still racing for the U.S. Postal Service team, and when Lance was winning his tours. And George had become a friend of mine, and so I started riding with George and just trying to hang on to his wheel. One of the best in the world, was just incredible training for me, and then training with good runners. And that's the thing about triathlons is, we joke that we're not really the best at all three sports. In fact, we stink at each one of them, but you put them all together and we can be really good. And so I would train with the best in each to make myself as better as I could be. And then you balance all of those together. So, George wrote the foreword for my book, and the Tour de France, as we're talking now, is going on right now. And, he's just a super fella and has been a great, mentor to me and friend to me and my family and my wife, and his son and my son are like best friends.
How amazing for one of the best domestiques in tour history, to be a guy that you can go out and ride in the mountains with, and go train yourself to try and hang on his wheel. And then, with the race across America, I want to educate the audience a little bit, because we've talked about the Tour de France. It's July. It's happening now when we're talking. And most of the grand tours are stage races. You go from point A to point B each day, and then the next day you go from point A to point B. But when you're not on the bike, you're in the hotel, or you're resting, you're sort of recovering, and maybe transferring from the finish line of stage one to the start line of stage two. But the race across America is a multi-day, week-long event from the West Coast to the East Coast. Right? There's no you go from San Diego to Vegas on day one, and then Vegas to Phoenix on day two, or whatever it is. You just go from the West Coast on the prescribed route to the East Coast as fast as you can. And there is a team, right? You trade out. It's not like you didn't compete and complete the race across America as an individual. But you rode through the night, and you and your teammates were always chewing up mileage. How, I mean, A, how do you train physically for that? B, how do you train physiologically in your diabetes management? And C, how do you train mentally for that?
Yeah. Again, that was one that I didn't see coming. I remember when I was asked to, at that point when I got asked to do that, I had been racing triathlons for several years. I qualified for the U.S. national team in 2004, long distance U.S. national team. And, I still didn't, I was pinching myself to believe that I actually qualified for the U.S. national long distance triathlon team. And I was like, I remember when I thought, can I even like run a marathon, and so, but on my second year on the U.S. team, I was in Denmark, and I just completed the ITU International Triathlon Union World Championship, my second year in a row. And I got an email in my hotel, I remember, in Denmark, from a guy who said he's putting together a team to ride the race across America, but he wants it to be people with diabetes. And so I had become somewhat known in the diabetes community, and he said, do you want to do it? And, and I thought, well, yeah. He said, it's called RAM. And I said, what's RAM? And he said, it's the race across America. And I said, well, it sounds like what you feel like when you finish. But you're right. It required me to really focus, to even add a different challenge. I was racing bikes and doing, running races and stuff like that. And I actually fractured my collarbone in a cycling race in February before we were supposed to race RAM in May. And so I had to do a lot of the last couple of months of my training all on an indoor trainer, because I couldn't ride outdoors. And I had to learn to ride at night. because you're right, we race 24 hours a day. The race is staged in June, when in North America we have the longest daylight for that reason, but you still race all night too. So I had headlamp, on my helmet, and learned to ride at night. And so I would go out at night, and my wife would follow behind me in a car, and I would just get used to going on mountain roads. And we would be on time trial bikes, when you're in a tuck position like this, or we would also be on road bikes depending on the terrain. So a lot of the training for that. The difference also was I was racing on a team of 8 guys. And you're right, I wasn't on the road the whole time, but depending on where we were, if we were climbing, the mountains of Colorado, I would do short intervals of maybe 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 minutes, one guy at a time, but you would just go max effort to keep going as fast as you could. And then the other guy couldn't go until your wheels crossed, and when my teammates would go. Whereas if we're in the deserts of Nevada or in the plains of Kansas, it could be 3, 4 of us out there at one time doing a time trial where we're just doing a rotation to block the winds. We could be out there for 45 minutes, an hour. So there's different strategies depending on where you are in the U.S.,
Wow.
which is also good. Tacticians, I love that part of it. And they would take advantage of my skill. I'm a larger guy. I'm 6'3", then racing, I was probably 180. Bigger guy, where we had some guys who were 5'8", 140, so they would spend a little more times in the mountains. But once you got into like Kansas and the wind's blowing, and I'm kind of like George. George is the same. We trade bikes, and I can just power through, for 30, 45 minutes, which is high intensity, high watts. And so it was a lot of training like that. Whereas the Ironman, I'm riding 112 miles, all on my own power, trying to conserve energy for the marathon coming up. I would just go lactate threshold for my interval, and then I'd have another interval at about an hour, and I would do that for 8 or 10 hours, and then I'd get to sleep maybe, or try to sleep. I'd be off the bike for 6 hours or so. Then I'd be back up again at 2 a.m. It was just constant fueling, monitoring blood sugar,
Wow.
hydration. It's a lot of logistics. Had a big crew
Yeah.
following us, 2 RVs, bikes.
That
It was fun. I love the challenge.
it sounds so awesome. And in a prior life, I thought, oh, that'd be great to put a team together and do that. I never considered that you would have multiple riders riding together, right? As a group, you'd never, I didn't think that you'd put 3 or 4 cyclists out together on the flats, because as a group in a time trial or a team time trial endeavor, you'd be faster than just an individual sprinting for 20 minutes and then trading off. Tactically, that's really interesting. I think something that I don't know that I've heard that story ever told before, about how the tactical piece of Race Across America comes together.
Well, if you watch like the tour, they have sometimes what's called a team time
Right.
trial, which is actually one of my favorite events. They didn't do it this year, but they've done it some years, and it's a beautiful event to watch a whole team get out there, and they are going 35, sometimes 40 miles an hour, and you have a guy who stays at the front for about 3 minutes. He rotates to the back. The next guy, it's just a constant, just beautiful of movement to just shield the wind, and that way the whole team can move faster than one guy or girl. And so it really is, depending on where you were in the country. I remember we were actually in Kansas. I'll never forget this. It was sometime in the middle of the night. By the time we got to Kansas, I mean, we'd gone over the California mountains, we'd gone through the deserts out west, we'd gone over the Rocky Mountains. We were in the plains, and it was dark, and you could just see the horizon, but it was so dark. There were storms out there, and we could see lightning. And I'm out there with 3 or 4 guys, and we're just doing this time trial, and on these time trial bikes, and the rain starts coming in. And it's just blinding rain, but it's so dark, it didn't really matter. All it cared was I could see a white line on the road that just looked like it went to the East Coast. But I remember just the lightning and the rain, and I was not going to stop, and as long as there was a vehicle behind me. And then we saw these blue lights that came, I could see it kind of in my rear, and it came up behind us, and it stopped, and a police officer stopped, and there was a tornado. that was coming across the fields. And we didn't know,
Right.
and we were getting ready to ride right into it, but it was just this blinding, blowing, rain. And so, at least I got to stop for, maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so, let the tornado go by. And then we kept on
So you
going. But,
literally raced a tornado to win the race across America.
I may have been a little bit faster than the Wicked Witch of the West in Dorothy's. Hopefully I was, but I probably looked about the same.
That's what an incredible experience. And what a great way. Like the thing that struck me is what a great way to see all the countryside, right? At probably sometime you're doing 8, 10, 12, 15 miles an hour. Sometimes you're doing 20, 25, 30. Um, but at that speed, yes, you're focused on the rhythm of working with your team in a time trial cycle like that, sprinting when your watts are up and your lactate is building and you're dying at thin air in the high altitude. But you also get a chance, I'm sure you got a chance to absorb the countryside in those moments and really take in the beauty of and the varied beauty of the US from coast to coast.
Yeah, absolutely. It was amazing because when you're on a bike, your senses are just so in tune. Just, you don't have headphones on. I had a radio that I could hear my team, and my director telling me when I had to turn or something like that. But the rest is just a silence. It's just the breathing. It's my wheels. It's if I had a disc wheel on, and then I could just literally see and just exist with whether it's in the middle of the night or even during the day. It was, except when we were going through metropolitan areas, which we didn't go through that many, just to look. I mean, I just saw wildlife. I just saw going by farmhouses, going by domestic houses. People would just look at us as we went flying by. And you really are just a visitor to people's lives for a few seconds. I remember going, I was in West Virginia and I was descending, kind of a windy mountain road. And I came around a road and it was in dark, in the night. And there was a possum that just had come right across the road, right as I came around the road. And I'll never forget, this possum just kind of looked up at me and I thought, okay, possum, it's either me or you. I said, because I don't think I've got this ability to get around you. And I said, I'm going to try to lift my front wheel up and get over you. But all I could do was lift my front, just bumped up a little bit, and just had to just go right over this possum. I don't know what happened to him, but, I know that I went right over a possum's head, and just seeing just deer and turkey and, all the way across to the Atlantic. It was amazing to be in touch with the country.
Quite literally a possum speed bump in the middle of West Virginia there. So talking about speed bumps, it's the name of the podcast. I want to get there a little bit. Your diagnosis is one of the more obvious speed bumps in your life that you've overcome. One of the things we've talked about on the show before, and I think I continue to ask my guests is, have there been any big silent speed bumps? Maybe people don't know about or don't see, haven't heard the story about you overcoming these silent speed bumps before, but when you look back on them, you're really proud of the ability to handle that obstacle and overcome that challenge.
Well, in any path, it seems like, okay, yeah, Jay, it sounds simple. You raced a marathon, and you decided to race triathlons, you raced the Ironman, then you qualify for the U.S. national team. Yeah, it was just a linear path up. But, I was, there were a lot of speed bumps, at least in triathlons along the way. Ones that I talk about in my book a little bit is, is learning from failure. And, whether it's in athletics or whether it's in, academics or artistry or anything you set your goal to. I remember trying to qualify for the U.S. national team, and it was about my 5th year of racing triathlons, and I had raced in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and it was my first race that I didn't finish. My goal was always to at least finish, and I'm not a quitter. But I couldn't finish that race, and I dropped out at mile 132. And you know what it's like as as an athlete who's trying to, you don't want to quit, you don't want to give up. And but physically I couldn't. And then I raced another race in Wisconsin, and that one I had a horrible race and I finished in like 14 hours. It was the longest, worst time I'd had. And I was really starting to question myself and my ability and whether I was doing it right, and there you got to think, okay, what do I need to change? And it was the last race of the year in November, which is Ironman Florida. I'd raced the race a bunch of times, and it's the same day as the New York Marathon. And so I was racing that race, and I had a really good swim, and I came out of the water with the top leaders, which is rare for me because I'm not one of the better swimmers. But I had worked really hard then for the bike portion of the race to work on my nutrition because, the Ironman is so physically demanding that it's ironically the smartest athlete who wins. And I had not been real smart about how I raced. I had not really been as precise with my nutrition and precise with my hydration. And I was really meticulous that race about monitoring that. And then I got off the bike and I was still up close with the leaders. And as I started running that marathon, I felt good. And I remember carrying it all the way to the end of that marathon. And, the book that I wrote, I call it Finish Line Vision. It's that last 100 meters of the Ironman. As I'm coming down that finish line, at that point, I was ahead of half of the professional field. And I thought, I literally had tears in my eyes as I'm running down that finish line because, a month and a half ago, I had barely even finished. 2 months ago, I had to drop out. And it's one of those where no one had known that as I'm running across that finish line, how close I had come just to giving up and quitting. But I was able to finish and break 10 hours and, beat half the professional field. So it was a thrill for me.
You talk about that finish line vision and running down the finish line at the end of an Ironman when you're mid-pack with professionals, especially after having two really challenging races that made you question if you were going to keep doing this, gave me goosebumps, like from the top of my head down. Unbelievable. Just a vision and perspective on that, because I think we've all been there. If it's in athletics, if it's in life, if it's in business, we all have those moments where we're not sure we're going to keep going. And then you do. And then you're like racing down this finish line. What a great mentality and a great perspective on that. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Now, I had a question just logistically. While you were on the U.S. long distance national triathlon team, was that your sole job? Were you a professional triathlete at that moment, or were you practicing law on the side, or was it just athletics that were paying the bills?
Yeah, I was absolutely still practicing law. And people ask me, how did I have the time to do that? At that point I was not married when I first started. Then I got married. I didn't have kids. And so, you always have time for the things that are important to you. And so I would just spend my time, I would go to work, practice law. I would train in the morning before work. I'd train at lunch. I'd train after work. And then once I made the US team, I started getting some, a little bit of notoriety in the triathlon community. So then I started getting sponsors. And so that helped. So I wasn't ever really to cut off or cut back from practicing law, but I maybe cut down a little bit, but not much. I still had that full-time job. But I was not racing professionally, no. I still was racing as an amateur. And I didn't ever attempt to try to turn pro because I needed to. You weren't getting paid a whole bunch. The U.S., even the Olympic athletes, bless them, they don't get paid that much. Even back then, also like college athletes didn't get paid. They can now, but so I was very much racing as an amateur, and then still working as a lawyer, my day job, as a lawyer. So that was a part of it. But I was starting to get some speaking engagements after that, which I really enjoyed. And it was just, to me, it was payment to inspire people to do that. So,
okay. So here on Speed Bumps, we ask the same three questions, but I'm going to throw an additional question at you to start this. You talked about the speaking events and how much you enjoy inspiring people and sharing that finish line vision you talked about. What has been the coolest or most interesting, most impactful for you speaking event you've ever done? And I know that's a hard question. I will preface this because if you ask me, I'm not sure I could pick one. So I'll give you a couple extra seconds to think about that. What when you look back and go, oh man, or a type of event even, you think, oh, those are always so great. You come away just buzzing.
Um, wow, and I know you and I have traveled together and spoken together at events. It's so, it's so it's inspiring to me that I can speak to an audience. I've spoken to 5,000 people before, and just holding them in my hands and taking them on a journey with me. But honestly, I'd say that actually the one that I think about the most that was impactful for me was I was speaking in a diabetes camp. And I know you've done that a lot too. And it was in California, and I'll never forget this. I was talking about it was in Kings Mountain, right outside of Sequoia National Park, and there's a diabetes camp there, and it was probably only about maybe 100 kids or so, and I was kind of telling my story. And all these kids had type 1 diabetes. It was the middle of the summer, and as I finished it, they asked for questions, and I'll never forget this little girl after I had just kind of told this same story about racing the Ironman and qualifying for the U.S. team and crossing the finish line and being so happy and proud of myself and having done it with diabetes. And she said, if you could go back, and she was about maybe 10-ish years old, and she said, if you could go back and never get diabetes, would you do it?
Oh, wow.
And I was like, wow. um, because I think she was struggling with that. She was a 10-year-old. She was been sent to camp. She's got this guy telling her about overcoming obstacles and doing things with diabetes. And so I kind of looked at her, and all these kids were just looking at me, and I said, no, I don't think I would. I don't think I would go back and take away diabetes. I said, because it's who I am now. It has become who I am, and it's actually enabled me to do things that I never would have done. Because I wouldn't be here today talking to you. I wouldn't be on the U.S. national team. I wouldn't have the opportunity to inspire people if I did not ever get diabetes or have diabetes happen to me. So if I can tell you, you can't make it go away, make it the best thing that ever happened to you. So I still think about it because I had the opportunity to sit here and talk to that little girl like that and try to explain to her that, no, it's not something that I wanted, but now I've tried to make the bad thing the best thing that ever happened to me. And hopefully I teach that to my kids, and hopefully I live that to others, that that's what we have to do. You can't go back and change it.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you talk about diabetes camps being enjoyable to speak at. I think they're a lot of fun. Most of the times I'm trying to figure out how to stay as a camper because they look like they're having so much
Mhm.
fun. But my
Yeah.
perspective, and I think, and I don't know if yours is the same way, but being a father now, having kids, we've got a 4 and a 5.5 year old, so a little younger than your children. But as a father now, I look at those visits to diabetes camps as a real opportunity to educate and inspire and give them another perspective, especially to look at their diabetes in a new light, and figure out, like you say, make the bad thing the best thing. And some of those words, it really resonates for me. Okay, now the same three questions we ask all of our guests here on Speed Bumps. What is the best advice you've ever received, and from whom did you receive it?
Hmm. Yeah. That one, guy, I've had just the pleasure to talk to so many people, and of course my my dad, who's just been he's still with me. He's 84 years old, and I remember when I was growing up, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And he after I was diagnosed with diabetes, he looked at me and he said, "Jay," he said, "you have a long life to live ahead of you." And he said, similar to what I was telling that girl, he said, you're not responsible for what happens to you, but you are responsible for how you respond to what happens to you. So he said, so respond to this in a way that's going to make this something that you will be proud of and you will be able to be successful. So, in a way, I was paraphrasing what he told me, but he just said, you're not responsible for it happening to you, but you are responsible for how you respond to it. So I remember that.
I love that.
Um, so, I've tried to live that.
Well, and you're doing a great job. And okay, dream car in your garage. And do you have it? Have you ever had the chance to drive it? What does that look like? I'm a car guy, so I've got to ask a car question.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the hybrid electric vehicles, and so I would really like an electric, a Tesla SUV, one of the larger SUVs. So that's something now that it's the next vehicle that I want to get. And I know you're a car guy, of course, and I remember coming to the 500 with you, and being able to hang out in the pits with you and Kathleen and act like I knew what was going on. I even watched you, Charlie. I think you were having an electrical problem one time in one of your races, and you had dropped all the way to the back of the pack. And you told me after the race, you said you were actually even considering like trying to rip something out of your car and tossing on the track to see if you could get a caution. If you were getting ready to get lapped. And I thought, what a little bit of inside history that you're going to try to rip some Velcro out, just in some, toss it out on the track. But then after the race, we hung out for several hours, and you had just been driving 500 miles for 240 miles an hour. And then you drove us back to the hotel driving 35 miles an hour. I'm like, how do you make that transition? How do you do that?
Well, and it's such a different mindset, right? Like for me, and I'm sure there are correlations to, if you take your kids to the pool, it's not like you're going to go swim 2 miles with your kids in the pool, right? When I get out of the race car from 200 miles an hour and I get in a road car, all of a sudden it's more than a single
Yes.
seater, and there are cup holders and there's cruise control and there's radio, right? It's a very different mentality, and if you get on your bike to go bike around, bike along the beach with your kids on vacation, it's different than getting on a time trial bike and hunching over and doing 30 miles an hour for 3 hours. So it is similar, but it is such a different mindset at that moment.
Yeah. Well, I was impressed that you could make that transition.
Well, thank you. All right. So that was your dream car. Now, we as athletes and speakers, things like that, we get to meet some really cool people. We have some really interesting personal interactions. What's the most meaningful or coolest personal interaction you've ever had in with a celebrity or a pro athlete or even just, maybe that 10-year-old at the diabetes camp? When you look back over the last, I don't know, however many decades, what one moment sticks out to you and go, man, that was really special. And I don't know that I would have gotten that without being an Ironman, without having diabetes, without having gone through law school. What moment sticks out to you as a really meaningful interaction?
It actually happened right before I was diagnosed with diabetes. So it's not necessarily related to it, but, when I graduated from college, I took about a year off before going to law school, and I worked on Capitol Hill with the senator from South Carolina, Senator Strom Thurmond, and it was just fantastic to just spend some time with him. I was his personal assistant, and I was overqualified for the job. I, basically just drove him around and took him places, but I got to meet so many incredible people. I remember at one point I was standing with him, and he would introduce me to people and senators. And I remember a senator came up, and I knew exactly who it was. We were in the Senate chambers, and it was John Glenn, the astronaut who had orbited the Earth, and I knew exactly who he was. But Senator Thurmond just said, and he, in this Southern accent, Jay, I want you to meet a good friend of mine, Senator John Glenn from Ohio. And he said, Jay, it's John Glenn. And I was like,
I know.
I know who this is. Yeah, I was 4 years old, and I sat there and I got to shake the hand of John Glenn, who's just a hero in American history and just exploration. And I was like, what do I ask him? Like, what do I say? And he just kind of looked at me and said, nice to meet you. And he said, tell me about you. And my life just seemed so inconsequential at that point. And I said, I didn't want to say, what's it like to walk on the moon? But I just, just to sit here and talk to John Glenn, about that. And he said, it was just a wonderful experience. It was a huge team, and I owe a lot to just so many people to help us, to do that. I remember that, and I remember I got to sit in on the State of the Union in the House chamber and watch that when George Bush gave his State of the Union speech in 1991. And that's a hard ticket to get, but they were able to let me sit up there and watch that. So just things that are not athletic related, but just experiences in life that I'm just so honored that I could touch pieces and people and history. And it's just a thrill. And then guys, like with you and Lou Brock, and sitting there and talking to Lou Brock, just about what it was like to play baseball, in the 50s and the 60s, and hear his stories. And he was such a gentleman to you and to me when we would sit there and talk to him about that.
Yeah, I remember those conversations with Lou, and man, he could people could tell stories. He could tell a story, man. Like you talk about holding 5,000, big audiences in your hand and take them on a journey with you. Like, he was a masterclass in that, and a true gentleman, as you said, a true sporting gentleman. Well, what an incredible story, from law school to a bike, from a marathon to Ironmans and meeting an astronaut. Really appreciate the time, Jay. Thank you very much. We'll make sure to link the opportunity for people to follow Finish Line Vision and keep up and read some of your inspirations, be a part of that. Thank you for joining us on Speed Bumps, and look forward to seeing you and your family soon, Jay.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.